Leaving Portsmouth. Philip first tried to get the fleet to sail on the 10th of May, but a dispute by sailors of the Fishburne about pay, they refused to leave until resolved. The fleet finally left Portsmouth, England on the 13th of May, 1787. The journey began with fine weather, and thus the convicts were allowed on deck. The fleet was accompanied by the armed frigate HMS Hyena until it left English waters. On the 20th of May 1787, one convict on Scarborough reported a planned mutiny. Those allegedly involved were flogged and 2 were transferred to Prince of Wales. In general, however, most accounts of the voyage agree that the convicts were well behaved. On the 3rd of June 1787, the fleet anchored at Santa Cruz at Tenerife. Here, fresh water, vegetables and meat were brought on board. Philip and the chief officers were entertained by the local governor, while one convict tried unsuccessfully to escape. On the 10th of June, they set sail to cross the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro, taking advantage of favourable trade winds and ocean currents. The weather became increasingly hot and humid as the fleet sailed through the tropics. Vermin such as rats and parasites such as bedbugs, lice, cockroaches and fleas tormented the convicts, officers and marines. Bilges became foul, and the smell, especially below the closed hatches, was overpowering. While Philip gave orders that the bilge water was to be pumped out daily and the bilges cleaned, these orders were not followed on Alexander, and a number of convicts fell sick and died. Tropical rainstorms meant that the convicts could not exercise on deck, as they had no change of clothes and no method of drying wet clothing. Consequently, they were kept below in the foul, cramped holds. On the female transports, promiscuity between the convicts, the crew and marines were rampant, despite punishments for some of the men involved. In the doldrums, Philip was forced to ration the water to 3 pints a day. The fleet reached Rio de Janeiro on the 5th of August and stayed for a month. The ships were cleaned and water taken on board. Repairs were made and Philip ordered large quantities of food. The women convicts' clothing had become infested with lice and was burnt. As additional clothing for the female convicts had not arrived before the fleet left England, the women were issued with new clothes made from rice sacks. While the convicts remained below deck, the officers explored the city and were entertained by its inhabitants. A convict and a marine were punished for passing forged quarter dollars made from old buckles and pewter spoons. The fleet left Rio de Janeiro on the 4th of September to run before the westerlies to the Table Bay in southern Africa, which it reached on the 13th of October. This was the last port of call, so the main task was to stock up on plants, seeds and livestock for their arrival in Australia. The livestock taken on board from Cape Town, destined for the new colony, included 2 bulls, 7 cows, 1 stallion, 3 mares, 44 sheep, 32 pigs, 4 goats, and a very large quantity of poultry of every kind. Women convicts on Friendship were moved to other transports to make room for livestock purchased there. The convicts were provided with fresh beef and mutton, bread and vegetables to build up their strength for the journey and maintain their health. The Dutch colony of Cape Town was the last outpost of European settlement, which the fleet members would see for years, perhaps for the rest of their lives. Before them stretched the awesome, lonely void of the Indian and Southern Oceans, and beyond that lay nothing they could imagine. Assisted by the gales in the roaring 40s, latitudes below the 40th parallel, the heavily laden transport surged through the violent seas. In the last 2 months of the voyage, the fleet faced challenging conditions, spending some days becalmed and on others covering significant distances. Friendship travelled 166 miles one day, while a seaman was blown from Prince of Wales at night and drowned. Water was rationed as supplies ran low, and the supply of other goods, including wine, ran out altogether on some vessels. Van Diemen's Land was sighted from Friendship on the 4th of January 1788. A freak storm struck as they began to head north around the island, damaging the sails and masts of some of the ships. On the 25th of November, Philip had transferred to Supply. With Alexander, Friendship and Scarborough, the fastest ships in the fleet, which were carrying most of the male convicts, Supply hastened ahead to prepare for the arrival of the rest. Philip intended to select a suitable location, find good water, clear the ground, and perhaps even have some huts and other structures built before the others arrived. This was a planned move, discussed by the Home Office and the Admiralty prior to the fleet's departure. However, this flying squadron reached Botany Bay only hours before the rest of the fleet, so no preparatory work was possible. Supply reached Botany Bay on the 18th of January 1788. The 3 fastest transports in the advance group arrived on the 19th of January. Slower ships, including Sirius, arrived on the 20th of January. It was soon realised that Botany Bay did not live up to the glowing account that the explorer Captain James Cook had provided. The bay was open and unprotected. The water was too shallow to allow the ships to anchor close to the shore. Fresh water was scarce and the soil was poor. First contact was made with the local indigenous people, the Eora, who seemed curious but suspicious of the newcomers. The area was studded with enormously strong trees. When the convicts tried to cut them down, their tools broke, and the tree trunks had to be blasted out of the ground with gunpowder. The primitive huts built for the officers and officials quickly collapsed in rainstorms. The Marines had a habit of getting drunk and not guarding the convicts properly, whilst their commander, Major Robert Ross, drove Philip to despair with his arrogant and lazy attitude. Crucially, Philip worried that his fledgling colony was exposed to attack from those described as Aborigines or from foreign powers. Although his initial instructions were to establish the colony at Botany Bay, he was authorized to establish the colony elsewhere if necessary. On the 21st of January, Philip and a party which included John Hunter departed the bay in 3 small boats to explore other bays to the north. Philip discovered that Port Jackson, about 12 kilometres to the north, was an excellent site for a colony with sheltered anchorages, fresh water and fertile soil. Cook had seen and named the harbour but had not entered it. Philip's impressions of the harbour were recorded in a letter he sent to England later. The finest harbour in the world, in which 1,000 sail of the line may ride in the most perfect security. The party returned to Botany Bay on the 23rd of January. On the morning of 24th of January, the party was startled when 2 French ships, the Astrolabe and the Boussole, were seen just outside Botany Bay. This was a scientific expedition led by Jean-François de la Perouse. The French had expected to find a thriving colony where they could repair ships and restock supplies, not a newly arrived fleet of convicts considerably more poorly provisioned than themselves. There was some cordial contact between the French and British officers, but Philip and La Perouse never met. The French ships remained until the 10th of March before setting sail on their return voyage. They were not seen again and were later discovered to have been shipwrecked off the coast of Vanikoro in the present-day Solomon Islands. On the 26th of January 1788, the fleet weighed anchor and sailed to Port Jackson. The site selected for the anchorage had deep water close to the shore, was sheltered and had a small stream flowing into it. Philip named it Sydney Cove after Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary. This date is celebrated as Australia Day, marking the beginning of British settlement. Contrary to popular belief, the British flag was not officially planted until 7th of February 1788, when possession was formally proclaimed. There was, as always, a British naval ensign erected at the site of the military encampment, and this had been performed on the evening of 25th of January 1788 in a small ceremony conducted by Philip and some officers and marines from Supply, with the remainder of Supply's crew and the convicts observing from on board ship. The remaining ships of the fleet did not arrive at Sydney Cove until later that day. Writer and art critic Robert Hughes popularised the idea in his 1986 book, The Fatal Shore, that an orgy occurred upon the unloading of the convicts, though more modern historians regard this as untrue, since the first reference to any such indiscretions is as recent as 1963. First contact. The First Fleet encountered Indigenous Australians when they landed at Botany Bay. The Cadigal people of the Botany Bay area witnessed the fleet arrive, and 6 days later, the two ships of French explorer La Perouse, the Astrolabe and the Boussole, sailed into the bay. When the fleet moved to Sydney Cove seeking better conditions for establishing the colony, they encountered the Eora people, including the Bidjigal clan. A number of the First Fleet journals record encounters with Aboriginal people. Although the official policy of the British government was to establish friendly relations with Aboriginal people, and Arthur Phillip ordered that the Aboriginal people should be well treated, it was not long before conflict began. This from the National Museum of Australia. 1789, smallpox breaks out in Sydney. There is still debate over how smallpox broke out in the Sydney area in 1789. The colonists had developed some resistance through earlier exposure to the disease. However, the local First Nations people had not, and its impact on them and First Nations people across the continent was devastating. David Collins, Judge Advocate of the Colony, April 1789. At that time, a native was living with us, and on taking him down to the harbour to look for his former companions, those who witnessed his expression and agony can never forget either. He looked anxiously around him in the different coves we visited. Not a vestige on the sand was to be found of human foot. Not a living person was anywhere to be met with. It seemed as if, flying from the contagion, they had left the dead to bury the dead. He lifted up his hands and eyes in silent agony for some time. At last he exclaimed, "All dead, all dead," and then hung his head in mournful silence. Without previous exposure to the smallpox virus, First Nations peoples had no resistance, and up to 70% were killed by the disease. The questions of how a more likely source of the disease was the variolis mater Surgeon John White brought with him on the first fleet. Variolis mater is pus taken from a recovering smallpox sufferer and sealed in a glass bottle to isolate and preserve it. White intended to use it to variolate any children born in the settlement. Research in the 1970s has shown that the smallpox virus withstands a wide range of temperatures and humidity and remains viable over many years. How this material could have infected the local tribes is unknown. The appalling devastation it wrought probably silenced anyone in the colony who might have known. Effect on First Nations peoples. Smallpox spread across the country with the advance of European settlement, bringing with it shocking death rates. The disease affected entire generations of the First Nations populations, and survivors were in many cases left without family or community leaders. The spread of smallpox was followed by influenza, measles, tuberculosis, and sexually transmitted diseases. First Nations people had no resistance to these diseases, all of which brought widespread death. List of massacres of Indigenous Australians. Colonial settlers frequently clashed with Indigenous people on continental Australia during and after the wave of mass immigration of Europeans into the continent, which began in the late 18th century and lasted until the early 20th. Throughout this period, settlers attacked and displaced Indigenous Australians, resulting in significant numbers of Indigenous deaths. These attacks are considered to be a direct and indirect, through displacement and hunger, cause of the decline of the Indigenous population during an ongoing colonising process of mass immigration and land clearing for agricultural and mining purposes. There are over 400 known massacres of Indigenous people on the continent. There are at least 26 recorded instances of mass poisonings of Aboriginal Australians. A project headed by historian Lyndall Ryan from the University of Newcastle and funded by the Australian Research Council has been researching and mapping the sites of these massacres. A massacre is defined as the deliberate and unlawful killing of 6 or more undefended people in one operation, and an interactive map has been developed. As of the 16th of November 2021, an estimated 304 massacres had been recorded as having taken place in the period between 1788 and 1930. As of 2022, The number of documented massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had risen to 412.
Possessed it under our own laws and customs.
The following list tallies some of the massacres of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by colonial authorities and settlers or their descendants, most of which took place during the mass immigration period.
60,000 years ago.
1790s to the 1920s.
Spiritual notion.
New South Wales, April 1794, Toongabbie, September 1794, Hawkesbury River, May 1795, Hawkesbury Region, September 1795, lower parts of the Hawkesbury, March 1797, a skirmish known as the Battle of Parramatta, March 1799, mouth of the Hunter River, 1800s, March 1806, Twofold Bay, 1810s, the Appin Massacre, 1818, Minnamurra River Massacre, 1824, Bathurst Massacre, 1826, Blackman's Point, 1827, Dringay Aboriginal Australians were shot dead for killing in reprisal a convict who had shot one of their camp dogs dead. 1827, a willow tree on the Liverpool Plains. 18th of December 1832, Borley Point. 1835, Williams Valley. 11th of July 1835, Darling River. 27th of May 1836, Mount Dispersion Massacre. 26th of January 1838, the Waterloo Creek Massacre, also known as the Australia Day Massacre. 1838, Mile Creek Massacre. 1838, Guida River. 28th of November 1838, Moree. 1838, near the confluence of the Murrumbidgee and Murray Rivers in New South Wales. June 1841, the Mackay River. 27th of August 1841, the Rufus River Massacre. 24th of October 1841, Duck Creek on the Bogan River. 1842, Evans Head Massacre. 1838 to 1851, the Macleay River. 29th of November 1847, Kangaroo Creek Poisoning. April 1849, Darling River. 1849, Hospital Creek. 1849, Barwon River. 1854, East Ballina Massacre. 1890, Bellingen, Tasmania. 1804, Brisbane Cove Massacre. 1827, near Hadspen.
For a better future.